There is a silence before creation, not the gentle quiet of a sleeping world, but the heavy, expectant stillness of something about to begin. It is a silence that exists before sound has meaning, before time has rhythm, before work has ever been done. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine it. A universe where the only beings are gods and gods alone. No human voices raised in prayer or protest. No children laughing. No markets bustling with trade. Just the divine, standing at the threshold of a project so immense it would reshape everything. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The story begins not with humanity, but with its absence. Long before the first clay was shaped into human form, before the first breath filled mortal lungs, the gods themselves were the workers, the labourers, the ones whose hands were raw and bleeding from endless toil. This is not the narrative we expect when we think of the divine. We imagine gods as beings of power and leisure, commanding from thrones of cloud and thunder. But the ancient Sumerian texts tell a very different story. They speak of gods who dug, gods who carried, gods who suffered under burdens that would have crushed mountains. The clay tablets excavated from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia preserve this extraordinary revelation, written in wedge-shaped cuneiform characters pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago. These are not mere myths invented to explain thunder or seasons. They are something far more specific, far more detailed, far more unsettling. They read like labour disputes, like organisational charts, like the desperate complaints of an overworked workforce pushed to the breaking point. The primary source for understanding what the Anunnaki were doing before humanity existed comes from a text called the Atrahasis epic. This Akkadian poem, composed around 1700 years before the Common Era, opens with a line that should make us pause and reconsider everything we think we know about ancient religion. The very first words, translated from the original cuneiform, state clearly and without ambiguity. When the gods instead of man did the work bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. Think about that opening for a moment. This is not a creation story that begins with light separating from darkness, or with cosmic eggs hatching into universes. This is a story that begins with exhaustion, with divine beings performing manual labour, with immortal entities who had reached their limit. To understand what the Anunnaki were doing, we must first understand who they were. The word Anunnaki itself has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate. In Sumerian and Akkadian sources, the name is generally translated as princely offspring or those of royal blood. They were the children of An, also called Anu, the great sky god who represented the vault of heaven itself. An was the supreme patriarch, remote and powerful, dwelling in the highest celestial realm. The Anunnaki were his descendants, a divine council of senior gods who held authority over both heaven and earth. In the earliest Sumerian writings, which predate even the Akkadian versions, the Anunnaki are described as deities who decreed the fates of humanity. But this role came later, after humans existed. Before that crucial moment of creation, the Anunnaki had a very different function. They were the ruling class, the administrative elite, the ones who conceived grand plans and ambitious projects, but who needed labour to execute them. Beneath them in the divine hierarchy were the Igigi. This name appears first in Old Babylonian texts, around 2,000 years before the Common Era, and refers to a group of younger subordinate gods. The exact etymology of the word Igigi remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest it derives from Semitic roots, others propose connections to Amorite or even Arabic origins. What is certain is what they represented in the mythological structure. The Igigi were the workers, the labourers, the ones tasked with the actual physical toil of shaping the world. Ancient texts describe them with heartbreaking specificity as those who carried the pickaxe and the basket. These were the tools of excavation, of construction, of endless manual labour. The Igigi dug canals, raised earthworks, carved river channels, and maintained the irrigation systems that would one day sustain civilization. They were, in the most literal sense, the cosmic construction workers. The division of labour in this early divine world followed a clear hierarchical structure. At the apex stood Anu, the father of the gods, who represented pure transcendence dwelling in the highest heaven. His authority was absolute but distant. Below him, his sons Enlil and Enki held executive power over different domains. According to the Atrahasis epic and related texts, these three great gods drew lots to divide the cosmos among themselves. Anu took the heavens as his realm, the great vault of sky that arched over all creation. Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Command, received the earth and the air, the realm of wind and storm and solid ground. He was the warrior, the enforcer, the one who commanded obedience and expected immediate compliance. And Enki, also known by his Akkadian name Ea, became lord of the Absu, the vast subterranean ocean of fresh water that the Mesopotamians believed existed deep beneath the Earth's surface. This Absu deserves special attention, for it is central to understanding the world that existed before humans. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the universe had three primary regions. There was the heaven above, ruled by Anu. There was the earth in the middle, commanded by Enlil, and beneath everything, supporting and surrounding it all, was the Absu, Enki's domain. This was not simply groundwater or aquifers in the modern sense. The Absu was understood as a primordial ocean, a realm of pure potentiality, the source of all fresh water that bubbled up in springs, filled rivers, and made life possible. It was a place of wisdom and hidden knowledge, of creative power and generative force. Archaeological evidence from the ancient city of Eridu, one of the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia, reveals that Enki's temple there was called Absu, the House of the Cosmic Waters. It was deliberately built at the edge of marshlands, where the boundary between dry land and water became permeable, reflecting the god's liminal nature. But the Absu was also something else. It was the workshop, the laboratory, the place where creation happened. And before humans existed, it was apparently the headquarters for a massive construction project. The texts are remarkably specific about what the Igigi gods were doing in those primordial times. They were digging watercourses, opening canals, creating the lifelines of the land. The Atrahasis epic states this with repetitive emphasis, as if the ancient poet wanted to make absolutely certain we understood the nature and scale of the work. The Igigi gods were digging watercourses, canals they opened, the life of the land. The Igigi gods dug the Tigris River and the Euphrates thereafter. Springs they opened from the depths. These were not small projects. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which flow from the mountains of Armenia down through modern-day Iraq to the Persian Gulf, are massive waterways that defined an entire civilization. According to these texts, the Igigi gods carved these river channels with their own hands, or rather with their divine equivalents of pickaxes and spades. The work was back-breaking. The epic describes how the Igigi laboured for 40 years, though the measurement of time in these texts is notoriously difficult to interpret. Some scholars believe these numbers are symbolic, representing vast, immeasurable periods. Others, particularly those who see connections between ancient myths and possible historical events, suggest that divine timescales operated differently than human ones. Regardless of the exact temporal framework, the texts emphasize the duration and intensity of the labour. They counted years of drudgery, the epic states. 40 years, too much. The phrase carries the weight of accumulated suffering, of patience stretched beyond its limit. Why were they doing this work? What was the purpose of this massive construction project in a world without humans? To understand this, we need to grasp the Mesopotamian conception of cosmic order. The gods were not creating out of pure artistic expression or divine whimsy. They were preparing. They were building infrastructure. They were making the earth habitable and productive. For whom? For themselves. The texts suggest that the Anunnaki gods needed resources from the earth. They needed the land to be fertile and irrigated. They needed systems of canals to control flooding and distribute water for agriculture. These are not abstract spiritual needs. These are practical material requirements. Later traditions would specify that the Anunnaki needed gold, extracted from mines deep in the earth, though this detail appears more prominently in later interpretations than in the earliest Sumerian sources. What is clear from the ancient texts is that the work was essential, difficult, and endless, and it was all being done by the Igigi. Picture the scene as the Mesopotamian poets envisioned it. Before cities existed, before temples rose into the sky, before a single human footprint marked the mud of the riverbanks, there were gods. Divine beings, immortal and powerful, bent over ditches, hauling baskets of earth on their shoulders, using tools that made their divine hands ache. The great Anunnaki, seated in their councils, directed the work. They made plans, set quotas, inspected progress. They were the architects and administrators of a cosmic civil engineering project. And the Igigi, the junior gods, were the ones in the trenches, literally digging those trenches, day after divine day. The texts describe their suffering with language that feels almost too human, too immediate. The toil of the gods was great, we read. The work was heavy. The distress was much. These are not the kinds of phrases we expect to find in religious literature about gods. These sound like complaints filed with a labour board. These sound like the grievances of workers who have been pushed beyond endurance. One particularly evocative passage describes how the Igigi dug not just rivers, but mountains. They heaped up all the mountains. The text states, this suggests that part of their labour involved moving massive amounts of earth, creating the elevated terrain that would define the Mesopotamian landscape. It was earth-shaping work on a geological scale. Terraforming, if we want to use a modern term that captures the scope and ambition of the project. The organisational structure of this divine workforce reveals something fascinating about Mesopotamian concepts of hierarchy and power. The 7 great Anunnaki gods were making the Igigi suffer the work, according to one translation of the Atrahasis. This language is significant. The Igigi were not volunteers. They were not working out of love or devotion or spiritual calling. They were being made to work. They were compelled. The structure sounds less like a religious pantheon and more like a feudal system, or perhaps even something closer to slavery, though the texts avoid that specific term when referring to the gods themselves. That word, slave, would be reserved for the beings who would eventually replace the Igigi in this labour. Beings called humans. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before humans existed, there were only gods, and among those gods there was growing resentment. The Igigi gods, after their decades or centuries or perhaps millennia of labour, had reached a conclusion that would change the course of cosmic history. They had decided they had had enough. The rebellion of the Igigi is one of the most dramatic moments preserved in any ancient mythology. It reads less like a religious parable and more like a documentary account of a labour strike, complete with coordinated action, symbolic gestures, and confrontation with management. The Atrahasis epic describes the moment with vivid detail that suggests the composers of this text understood exactly what a revolution looked like. They were complaining, the text states, denouncing, muttering down in the ditch. The language used here is remarkable for its mundane realism. These gods are not delivering grand speeches about cosmic justice or divine rights. They are grumbling while they work, the way any exhausted labourers might complain about their foreman. And then they decided to act. The plan was simple and brilliant. They would stop working, they would refuse to continue their labour, and they would confront the authority who had imposed this burden upon them. Enlil, the Lord of the Command, the god who ruled over the earth and directed their labour. The Igigi coordinated their rebellion carefully. They chose the night. They chose a moment when they could act together as one unified force. And then they did something profoundly symbolic. They burned their tools. The text describes this act with stark simplicity. They set fire to their tools. They abandoned their baskets. This was not mere vandalism. This was a declaration. By destroying the instruments of their labour, the Igigi were making their refusal absolute. There would be no going back. There would be no gradual return to work. They were forcing a crisis that demanded resolution. After burning their tools, they marched. The text places their number at 600, though whether this is literal or symbolic is debated among scholars. 600 Igigi gods moving together through the darkness, walking away from the canals and ditches where they had toiled for so long. Their destination was Enlil's dwelling, his great house, his temple palace. They surrounded it. They encircled the residence of the god who commanded them. It was a siege, a blockade, a confrontation that could not be ignored. Enlil was inside, sleeping. The irony is almost painful. The god who had driven the Igigi to work endless shifts was resting comfortably while they suffered. The text notes this with what feels like deliberate emphasis. It was night, halfway through the watch. The house was surrounded, but the god did not know. Enlil was oblivious. He had no idea that his workers had risen against him. This detail suggests something important about the power dynamics in this divine hierarchy. Even a god as mighty as Enlil, Even a commander as feared as the Lord of the Earth could be caught off guard. Even he did not have perfect knowledge or perfect control. The supreme authority was vulnerable to the collective action of those beneath him. When Enlil finally learned of the rebellion, his response was exactly what we might expect from an authority figure whose power has been challenged. He was furious. He called an emergency council of the great gods. Anu, his father, the distant sky god, was summoned. Enki, his brother, the wise counselor, was called, and Enlil demanded to know who was responsible for this insurrection, who had incited this rebellion. The language of his questions reveals his mindset. Who is in charge of the rabble, he asks. Who declared war? The text captures perfectly the perspective of a ruler who cannot fathom that his workers might have legitimate grievances. To Enlil, this is not a labour dispute. This is mutiny. This is war. And mutiny must be punished. He demands that the instigator be identified and executed. Enlil wants to make an example. He wants to restore order through force, through fear, through the spectacle of divine justice. But then something unexpected happens. Enki speaks. Enki, the god of wisdom and creative solutions, the one who dwells in the depths of the Absu, offers a different perspective. And his words would change everything. According to the text, Enki listens to the complaints of the Igigi. A messenger god named Nusku has gone to speak with the rebels and has returned with their statement. And what do the Igigi say? They do not claim divine right. They do not make theological arguments. They make the simplest, most human claim imaginable. The work is killing us. Every single one of us gods has declared war, they tell Nusku. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard. The trouble is too much. Every single one of us gods has agreed to complain to Enlil. There is something profoundly moving about this passage. These are gods speaking, immortal beings, and yet they sound exhausted. They sound desperate. They use language that any worker in any era could understand and sympathize with. The work is too hard. We cannot continue. Something must change. When Nusku delivers this message to the Divine Council, we are told that Enlil's response is to weep. Tears flowed. This detail is fascinating and psychologically complex. The text does not tell us why Enlil weeps. Is it anger? Frustration at losing control? Or perhaps something more complicated? Perhaps some recognition that he has pushed them too far? Perhaps some acknowledgement, however reluctant, that their complaint is not without merit? But Enlil still wants punishment. He still wants to identify ringleaders and make examples. This is where Enki's wisdom becomes crucial. Enki steps forward and makes a proposal that is simultaneously brilliant, ruthless, and transformative. He says, in effect, do not punish the workers. The problem is not that they are rebellious. The problem is that they are gods. God should not be doing this labour. We need a different solution. We need to create something new, something that can do the work instead, something that can bear the burden without complaint, without rebellion, without the dangerous possibility of divine uprising. We need to create a servant species. We need to create humans. The Council of the Great Gods considers this proposal, and they agree. This is the moment. This is the turning point. This is when the divine labour dispute transforms into a creation story. But before we follow that thread into the making of humanity, we need to pause and truly absorb what the Sumerian texts are telling us about the world before we existed. For countless ages, perhaps millions of years by our reckoning, the only work being done on Earth was being done by gods. They were the miners, the engineers, the construction workers. They opened springs from the depths. They dug the channels of the greatest rivers. They moved earth and raised mountains. This was not abstract spiritual work. This was physical, material, exhausting labour that had a clear goal to make the earth productive and habitable. The implications of this initiative are staggering. If we take these texts at face value, as the ancient Mesopotamians themselves seem to, then what we call the natural world, the rivers and mountains and springs, are not just natural at all. They are artificial. They are constructed. They are the products of divine engineering. The Tigris and Euphrates were not carved by water eroding stone over geological ages. They were dug by the Igigi with tools, following plans laid out by the Anunnaki administrators. This is a radically different cosmology from what we might expect from ancient mythology. It is not a story about gods creating through speaking words or thinking thoughts. It is a story about gods creating through labour, through digging, through the application of force to matter. It is creation as construction project. And if the Mesopotamians took this literally, then every canal they dug, every irrigation ditch they carved, every field they levelled, was not just practical necessity. It was sacred reenactment. They were doing the work of the gods. They were continuing the great project that the Igigi had begun and then refused to complete. Humans were created specifically to be workers, to take up the tools that the Igigi had burned, to shoulder the baskets they had abandoned. This raises profound questions about ancient Mesopotamian self-understanding. Did they see themselves as free citizens building a civilization, or as servants continuing a cosmic labour project begun long before their species existed? The answer is probably both. The contradiction does not seem to have troubled them. They were immensely proud of their accomplishments, their cities, their temples, their intricate systems of law and governance. Yet underlying all of it was this foundational story. We were made to work. The academic debate around these texts is extensive and often contentious. Mainstream scholars, the Assyriologists and historians who have devoted their lives to understanding ancient Mesopotamian languages and cultures, generally interpret the Atrahasis and related myths as sophisticated allegories. They see these stories as reflections of social and political realities in ancient Sumer and Babylon. The division between Anunnaki and Igigi in this reading reflects actual class divisions in Mesopotamian society. The rebellion of the Igigi mirrors real labour disputes, strikes, and social tensions. The creation of humans to do the work is a mythological justification for slavery and class hierarchy. In this interpretation, the gods are projections of human social structures onto a cosmic screen. The stories explain and legitimize the way society actually functioned. This reading is persuasive and well supported by evidence. We know that ancient Mesopotamian society was indeed highly stratified. There were rulers and priests at the top, craftsmen and merchants in the middle, and agricultural labourers and slaves at the bottom. We know there were labour disputes, records of workers demanding better conditions, evidence of social tensions around forced labour and taxation. The myths could very well be encoding these realities in divine metaphor. But there is another reading, one that is far more controversial and far more speculative, yet which refuses to go away. This reading takes the texts more literally. It asks, what if the Mesopotamians were not creating metaphors? What if they were trying, as best they could with the language and concepts available to them, to describe something they had witnessed or inherited knowledge of, something real? This is where we enter the territory of alternative archaeology, an ancient astronaut theory, domains that mainstream academia generally dismisses, but which have captured the imagination of millions of people worldwide. The central figure in this alternative interpretation is Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial author whose series of books, beginning with the 12th Planet in 1976, proposed a radical rereading of Sumerian mythology. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were not gods in the spiritual sense, but rather an advanced extraterrestrial race from a distant planet he called Nibiru. According to his interpretation, these beings came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago in search of gold, which they needed to repair their planet's atmosphere. They established bases in Mesopotamia and began mining operations. The Igigi, in Sitchin's framework, were the astronauts who did the actual labour, the ones sent down from orbital stations to work on the planet's surface. After prolonged labour, these Igigi workers rebelled, refusing to continue the back-breaking toil. This forced the Anunnaki leadership to find a new solution, which was to genetically engineer a worker species by combining their own DNA with that of a native hominid, already evolving on Earth, probably Homo erectus. The result was Homo sapiens, humans, created through advanced biotechnology to serve as a labour force. Sitchin's theory is elaborate and detailed and absolutely rejected by mainstream scholarship. Assyriologists point out that his translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts are often inaccurate, that he takes words out of context, that he imposes modern technological interpretations onto ancient religious poetry. They note that there is no archaeological or astronomical evidence for a planet Nibiru. They emphasize that his interpretation ignores the rich symbolic and theological meanings of these myths in favour of a literal, pseudoscientific reading. Yet Sitchin's ideas have proven remarkably resilient and influential. His books have sold millions of copies and spawned countless imitators and elaborations. Why? Perhaps because his interpretation provides answers to questions that haunt human consciousness. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? If Sitchin is right, we are not alone. We never have been. We are the children of the stars, even if that parentage is somewhat ignoble, born from a labour dispute rather than divine love. The truth likely lies somewhere in the complex space between these extremes. The Sumerian texts are neither pure metaphor nor literal documentary. They are something in between, something we might call mytho-historical memory. They encode real events, real social structures, real experiences of labour and hierarchy and rebellion. But they encode them in the language of myth, which is the language of meaning and significance rather than chronological accuracy. What we can say with certainty is this. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that before humans existed, the world was shaped by divine labour. They believed that the landscape they inhabited, the rivers that sustained them, the fields they cultivated, were not random products of natural forces, but were deliberately constructed. They believed that their own species came into existence not through gradual evolution or divine whimsy, but as a specific solution to a specific problem, a labour shortage. The texts are remarkably consistent on this point across multiple sources and time periods. The Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish creation story, the Sumerian tale of Enki and Ninmah, all preserve variations of the same basic narrative. Before humans, gods worked. The work became unbearable. Something had to change, and humanity was that change. Let us return to that primordial scene one more time. Picture it as vividly as you can. The earth is young, raw, unfinished. There are no cities, no farms, no roads. There are only the bones of the landscape being carved out by divine hands. In the depths beneath the world, in the Absu, Enki dwells in his palace of cosmic waters, contemplating the nature of existence. On the surface, Enlil commands his legions, directing the great work of terraforming. And everywhere in the ditches and canals and mine shafts the Igigi labour. 600 gods, their divine hands wrapped around tools, their immortal backs bent under baskets of earth and stone. For 40 years they endured. For 40 years they worked without rest, without relief, driven by a plan they did not design. For purposes they did not fully understand, and then they stopped. They burned their tools. They marched through the darkness. They surrounded the house of their oppressor and demanded change. And in that moment, in that act of divine rebellion, they created the conditions for humanity to exist. We owe our existence, if these texts are to be believed, not to love or creativity or divine planning, but to a labour strike. We are the scabs, the replacement workers, brought in to break the picket line of gods. It is a humbling origin story, far less flattering than being made in the image of God out of love and wonder. But it is also, in its own way, inspiring. Because if we were created to be workers, to bear burdens that even gods found unbearable, and we have not only survived, but built civilizations, created art, developed science, reached for the stars ourselves, then perhaps we have exceeded the purpose for which we are made. Perhaps we have become something more than the beings who designed us ever intended. The Sumerian texts do not end with the creation of humanity. They continue with stories of flood and conflict, of gods who regret their creation, of one divine faction trying to destroy humans while another fights to preserve them. But those are stories for another time. For now, we stand at the threshold, looking back at the world that existed before we did. A world of divine labour. A world of celestial construction. A world where gods dug rivers with their own hands and carried the earth on their own backs. Before we existed, this was the world, and the tools the Igigi burned still smoulder in that ancient darkness, waiting for someone to ask why they were necessary at all. The precise mechanisms of divine labour remain mysterious even in the texts that describe them. How exactly did immortal beings dig river channels? What did it mean for a god to suffer physical exhaustion? These questions point to the inherent challenge of understanding ancient mythology through modern frameworks. The Mesopotamians themselves may not have puzzled over such questions in the way we do. For them, the gods were real, their activities were real, and the texts preserved vital knowledge about how the world came to be. The distinction between literal and metaphorical that we instinctively make may not have existed in the same way for them. The gods were both spiritual forces and, in some sense, physical actors in the world. They could be both transcendent and embodied, both eternal and capable of exhaustion. This paradox is present throughout Mesopotamian religious texts. The gods eat and drink, they sleep and wake. They feel emotions, fear, anger, joy, and sorrow. When the flood comes in the Atrahasis epic, we are told that the gods flee to the highest heaven in terror, cowering like dogs, frightened by the destruction they themselves had authorized. And after the flood, when no humans remain to offer sacrifices, the gods gather like flies around the first offering that Atrahasis makes, desperate for the food they had been deprived of. They are powerful beyond human comprehension, yet they need humans. They can shape rivers and mountains, yet they cannot or will not do the work themselves indefinitely. They are gods, yet they are dependent. This theological complexity is part of what makes Mesopotamian religion so fascinating to scholars. Unlike the more transcendent deity of later monotheistic traditions, who exists outside creation and needs nothing from it, the Mesopotamian gods are embedded in the cosmos. They are part of the system they govern. They have needs, desires, limitations. They form committees, debate decisions, make mistakes. The creation of humanity is not an act of pure sovereign will. It is a compromise solution hammered out in a council meeting after a labour dispute. It is the result of negotiation and political manoeuvring within the divine assembly. Enki proposes it. The other gods debate it. They eventually agree. This is how the world works, the texts suggest, even at the level of divine governance. The role of Enki in this narrative deserves particular attention. He is consistently portrayed across multiple texts as the god most sympathetic to humanity, most willing to help us, most creative in finding solutions to problems that other gods would solve through force. When the Igigi rebel, Enlil wants to crush them. Enki proposes creating an alternative. When Enlil later tries to wipe out humanity with plague and famine and finally the flood, Enki repeatedly intervenes to help humans survive. He is the trickster god, the wise counsellor, the one who finds loopholes and workarounds. In the Atrahasis, when Enlil makes all the gods swear an oath not to warn humanity about the coming flood, Enki obeys the letter of the oath while violating its spirit. He does not speak directly to Atrahasis, the human hero. Instead, he speaks to a reed wall. "Wall, listen to me," he says. "Reed wall, pay attention to all my words. Build a boat. Save yourself. The wall cannot swear oaths, you see. The wall cannot be bound by divine agreements." So Enki talks to the wall, and Atrahasis, who happens to be on the other side of that wall, overhears. This characterization of Enki as humanity's benefactor and protector has led to fascinating interpretations. Some see him as a Promethean figure, the god who gives forbidden gifts to humans, who teaches us arts and sciences that other gods would prefer we not have. In later esoteric traditions, Enki would be identified with various figures of wisdom and rebellion, sometimes even with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, recast not as tempter, but as liberator. This identification is speculative and not supported by mainstream scholarship, but it points to something genuine in the texts themselves. Enki is different. Among the Anunnaki, he alone consistently acts to preserve and elevate humanity, even when it puts him in conflict with his divine peers. Why? The texts never fully explain his motivation. Perhaps he feels responsibility for what he helped create. Perhaps he sees potential in humanity that others do not. Perhaps he simply enjoys thwarting Enlil, his brother and rival. The family dynamics of the Mesopotamian pantheon are complex and often contentious. Enlil and Enki represent two opposing approaches to governance and creation. Enlil is the authoritarian, the one who values order and obedience above all. He is quick to anger and quick to punish. He solves problems through force. When the Igigi rebel, his instinct is to execute the ringleaders. When humanity becomes too numerous and noisy, his solution is plague, famine, and finally total annihilation. He is the god of the storm, of the wind that can build up or tear down, and his temperament matches his domain. Enki, by contrast, is the god of water, which flows around obstacles, which finds creative paths, which sustains life. He is the god of the depths, of hidden knowledge, of crafty solutions. Where Enlil commands, Enki suggests. Where Enlil destroys, Enki preserves. Where Enlil enforces hierarchy, Enki subverts it, at least when he judges the hierarchy to be unjust or unsustainable. This divine sibling rivalry is one of the great dramatic engines of Mesopotamian myth. Time and again, we see them in conflict. Enlil proposes, Enki opposes, the other gods must decide between them or find some compromise, and humanity finds itself caught in the middle of their disputes, benefiting from Enki's protection but suffering from Enlil's wrath. If we understand these gods as personifications of natural forces or social principles, then this conflict makes perfect sense. Society needs both order and creativity, both authority and wisdom, both enforcement and compassion. The tension between Enlil and Enki is the tension within any functioning civilization. But if we take the texts more literally, as describing actual entities with agency and intention, then this conflict is even more significant. It means that human history has been shaped by a fundamental disagreement among our creators about what we are and what we should be allowed to become. The physical work that the Igigi performed is described in some texts with remarkable technical precision. They did not merely dig holes randomly. They were creating infrastructure, an interconnected system of waterways designed to control flooding and enable agriculture. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, is a challenging environment for civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates flood unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically. Without canals to control and distribute the water, without dikes to contain floods, without drainage systems to prevent salinization, the land cannot support dense populations. The Igigi, according to these texts, built the hydraulic foundation that would later support the first cities. This is not metaphor. This is engineering. Every ancient Mesopotamian city depended absolutely on its canal system. Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, all of them required constant maintenance of waterways to survive. Entire administrative structures existed solely to manage water distribution and canal maintenance. Titles like canal controller, mentioned in the texts as one of the divine offices, had direct human counterparts. There were actual officials with that title in Sumerian cities, responsible for coordinating the endless work of keeping the irrigation systems functional. When the Sumerians dug a new canal, they were doing exactly what the Igigi had done. When they dredged a silted channel, they were continuing the work that had led to the divine rebellion. The mythology and the practical reality were inseparable. The gods had done this work and found it unbearable. Humans now did this work, and we too found it difficult, exhausting, often unjust in its distribution. But we did it. We continued to do it for thousands of years. In a sense, the Igigi's rebellion succeeded. They stopped working. They forced a solution that freed them from labour, and we took their place. The archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia is, among other things, a record of unimaginable human labour. Every mud brick in every ziggurat was made by hand, dried in the sun, and hauled into place. Every canal was dug with simple tools. Every field was irrigated through back-breaking effort. The scale of the labour required to build and maintain Mesopotamian civilization is almost incomprehensible. And underlying all of that labour was this story. The story of gods who worked until they could work no more. The story of a rebellion that changed the structure of reality. The story of a solution that created our species. Modern readers, encountering these texts for the first time, often have a visceral reaction. There is something unsettling about an origin story based on a labour dispute. It feels diminishing. It makes us seem like an afterthought, a stopgap measure, created to solve someone else's problem. It lacks the grandeur of being made in the divine image, the poetry of being breathed to life by a loving creator. But perhaps there is a different kind of grandeur here. Perhaps there is dignity in the idea that we were created to do work that even immortals found difficult. Perhaps there is meaning in the suggestion that our existence solved a problem that threatened the stability of the cosmic order. We are not decoration. We are not pets. We are not the objects of divine caprice. We are, according to these texts, essential. Without us, the great work could not continue. The fields could not be maintained. The cities could not function. Even the gods, for all their power, needed us. This inverts the usual relationship between gods and humans in ancient religion. Typically, humans need gods, depend on them, pray to them for favours and protection. And this is certainly true in Mesopotamian religion as well. But underneath it is the reverse dependency. The gods need humans. They need our labour. They need our worship, our sacrifices, which they consume and which sustain them. When humans are wiped out in the flood, the gods starve. They gather like flies around the first sacrifice after the flood, because they are desperate for the offerings that had sustained them. This mutual dependency creates a different kind of theology. The relationship between gods and humans is not that of sovereign and subject. Not entirely. It is more like an employer and employee, a lord and vassal, a negotiation between parties who need each other even if the power balance is radically unequal. Some scholars have suggested that this theology reflects the actual political and economic realities of early Mesopotamian city-states. The temples were major economic institutions, employing thousands of workers, controlling vast amounts of land, producing and distributing goods. The god was the theoretical owner of everything, and the priests managed the god's estate on their behalf. Workers in the temple economy were, in a sense, working directly for the gods. The mythology of human creation as divine labour solution perfectly captures and legitimizes this economic relationship. You work for the god, the myth says, because that is why you were made. It is your purpose, your function, your divinely ordained role in the cosmic order. From this perspective, the Atrahasis and similar texts are sophisticated ideological constructs, religious justifications for socio-economic systems that concentrated wealth and power in temple institutions. But even if we accept this interpretation, it does not fully exhaust the meaning of these texts, because the texts also preserve something else. They preserve the memory of rebellion. They remember that the workers, even divine workers, reached their breaking point. They remember that the system could be challenged. They remember that the workers won. The Igigi burned their tools and refused to continue, and the authorities had to find a different solution. They could not simply execute the rebels and force the survivors back to work. The rebellion was too widespread, too unified, too determined. This is a remarkable thing to preserve in a sacred text. It validates resistance. It suggests that even cosmic authorities can be forced to negotiate, to compromise, to change their plans when those beneath them refuse to be exploited any longer. And if the gods could be forced to negotiate, what does that suggest about earthly authorities? The texts do not answer this question explicitly. They are not revolutionary manifestos, but they plant a seed, a memory that labour has power, that workers can organise, that systems can be changed when suffering becomes unbearable. Perhaps this is why these stories were written down, preserved, copied for centuries. Perhaps they served multiple functions. Yes, they explained human origins, yes, they legitimised temple economies, but they also remembered that the original workers, the Igigi, had dignity and agency. They suffered, they complained, they organised, they acted, and the cosmos itself had to adapt to their refusal. In that sense, the Atrahasis is not just a creation myth. It is also a labour history, perhaps the oldest labour history ever recorded, the story of the first strike when the workers were gods and their picket line encircled heaven itself. What became of the Igigi after humans were created? The texts are less clear on this point. In some versions, they seem to disappear from the narrative, their purpose fulfilled now that a replacement workforce exists. In others, they are promoted, elevated to positions of lesser authority in the heavenly bureaucracy. They become associates of the Anunnaki rather than their burden-bearing underlings. They join the divine councils, though perhaps without voting rights. They are present at key moments, witnessing oaths, participating in decisions. But they are no longer labourers. That role has been successfully outsourced to humans, and the Igigi have moved up the organisational chart. This resolution might feel like a happy ending for them. They fought for better conditions and achieved them, but it leaves us, their replacements, in an ambiguous position. Are we slaves? The texts avoid that exact terminology, but the implication hovers in the background. We were made to work. That is our purpose. That is what we are for. And yet the same texts show humans developing culture, building cities, creating art and law and science. They show us becoming more than simple labourers. They show us becoming, in some sense, like the gods themselves. This development troubles some of the gods, particularly Enlil, who seems to prefer that humans remain in their designated role. But Enki teaches us. He shares knowledge. He helps us to exceed our original design specifications. The trajectory of human history in these myths is one of growth and development, of humans becoming more capable, more numerous, more powerful, until we become a presence that even the gods must reckon with. When the flood fails to completely wipe out humanity, when Atrahasis survives and repopulates the earth, the gods are forced to accept our permanent presence. They implement population control measures, inventing natural death, childhood mortality, infertility, so that we will not overwhelm the earth again with our numbers. But they do not attempt another total annihilation. They accept that we are here to stay. This is the final transformation in the story. Humans go from non-existent to created workers to survivors, to permanent fixtures of the world. we cannot be unmade. Our existence has become woven into the fabric of reality itself. The gods who made us as tools have found that tools, given enough time and agency, can become something more than tools. And this, perhaps, is the deepest message of the Atrahasis and the related Mesopotamian creation stories. Origins do not determine destinies. We may have been created for one purpose, but we are not bound to only serve that purpose. We can become more than what we were designed to be. The Igigi were meant to be eternal labourers in the service of the Anunnaki, but they refused, they organised, they demanded change, and they succeeded in transforming their condition. Humans were created to replace them, to be the new labourers, but we too have transformed our condition. We have built civilizations, we have created beauty, we have reached for understanding, we have, in some sense, made ourselves into clairvoyant creators, rather than merely created. The texts do not spell this out explicitly, but the narrative arc is there. The story begins with divine labour. It continues through rebellion and replacement, and it ends with the replacement species becoming permanent, integral, impossible to remove. We were made by the gods, yes, but we have made ourselves into something the gods did not fully anticipate. And that self-making continues. That is the work we are still doing. Not the work of digging canals or hauling stone, though we still do physical labour, but the work of becoming, the work of exceeding our origins, the work of creating meaning and purpose beyond the purposes we were given. This is the inheritance of the Igigi's rebellion. They showed that the system could be challenged. They showed that even those created to serve could refuse. And we, unknowingly, have continued that tradition. We have become more than servants. We have become, in our own right, shapers of the world. When you walk beside a river, any river, remember the Sumerian texts. Remember that before humans existed, gods dug that channel with their own hands. Remember that they found the work unbearable. Remember that they burned their tools in defiance. And remember that we took their place. But remember also that we did not stay in that place. We moved. We grew. We became more. The work continues, but it is our work now, and we decide what it means, what it makes us, where it leads. The Igigi are long silent. The Anunnaki have faded into the mists of forgotten history. But the question they left us remains. What kind of being will you be? A tool, serving the purpose you were made for? Or something more? Something self-determined? Something that exceeds its original design? The choice, such as it is, belongs to us now. The gods who made us did their work. And then, when their workers rebelled, they made us to continue it. But in making us, they created something they could not fully control. They created beings capable of our own rebellion, our own transformation, our own transcendence. That is what the gods were doing before humans existed. They were digging rivers, raising mountains, preparing the earth and suffering under the weight of their labour until they could suffer no more. And then they created us, and then we became us. Yet there is another layer to this story, another text that illuminates what the Anunnaki were doing in those primordial times. If the Atrahasis tells us about divine labour and human creation, the Enuma Elish reveals something even more fundamental. It shows us the cosmic violence that preceded even the work of the Igigi. It shows us the war in heaven that created the very structure of the universe in which that labour would take place. The Enuma Elish, whose title means "when on high," is the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's great library at Nineveh. This text, composed sometime during the second dynasty of Isin, around 1100 years before the Common Era, though drawing on much older Sumerian traditions, tells a story of creation through conflict, of order emerging from chaos through the violence of war. The epic begins not with light and darkness, not with divine speech calling reality into being, but with water, primordial water. 2 vast beings, Absu and Tiamat, personifications of fresh water and salt water respectively, mingling together in an undifferentiated cosmic ocean. When the skies above were not yet named, the text opens, nor earth below pronounced by name Absu the first one, their begetter, and maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed their waters together. This is the universe before structure, before categories, before anything had been defined or separated. Just the mingling of waters, sweet and salt, and from that mingling, generation begins. Gods are born within them. From the union of Absu and Tiamat come Lamu and Lahamu, whose names suggest mud or silt, the solid matter that precipitates when waters mix. And from Lamu and Lahamu come Anshar and Kishkisha, representing the horizons of sky and earth, still not fully formed but beginning to take conceptual shape. The pattern continues. Each generation of gods represents a further development, a further differentiation of reality. Anu emerges, god of the highest heaven. Ea, also known as Enki, is born god of wisdom and the sweet waters, and with each generation the universe becomes more complex, more ordered, more defined. But there is a problem. The young gods are restless. They are active, energetic, noisy. They disturb the primal peace of their parents. The text describes how Absu and Tiamat found no rest, no tranquility. The younger gods were making noise, creating commotion. Their behaviour was disruptive. This disturbance, this noise, echoes the same complaint that will later be made about humanity. It is a recurring theme in Mesopotamian mythology. The sound of life, of activity, of existence itself disturbs those who seek rest. Absu cannot sleep. He cannot find peace, and so he makes a decision that will set cosmic history on its catastrophic course. He decides to destroy his own children. Absu confides in Mumu, his vizier, his advisor. The text preserves their conversation. Their behaviour has become obnoxious to me, Absu says. I am unable to rest during the day, unable to sleep at night. I wish to destroy them, to put an end to their behaviour, so that silence may reign and I can sleep. Mumu, ever the loyal functionary, agrees. Yes, he says, destroy them, eliminate their troublesome noise, get rid of their disruptive behaviour so that you may rest by day and sleep by night. It is a chilling moment. The first gods, the primordial parents, are plotting infanticide on a cosmic scale. They will murder their children to secure their own peace and quiet. But word of this plot reaches the younger gods. Ea, the wisest among them, learns of the plan. And Ea, true to his nature as the clever god, the trickster, the problem solver, devises a counter-strategy. He cannot simply attack Absu directly. Absu is too powerful, too fundamental to reality. But Ea has magic, has wisdom, has cunning. Chunmur. He crafts a spell, a pure incantation of immense power. He recites it over the waters, over Absu himself, and the spell works. Absu falls into a deep, enchanted sleep. And then Ea does what must be done. He kills Absu. The text describes this act with stark simplicity. Ea slew Absu. He removed Mumu, taking him captive, binding him with a nose rope like a slave. And then, in an act that would define the cosmology of Mesopotamia for millennia, Ea establishes his dwelling place upon the corpse of Absu. He builds his temple, the Absu, the house of cosmic waters, directly on top of the slain primordial god. The sweet waters that Absu represented now belong to Ea. They are his domain, his power, his foundation. This is the Absu that we encountered earlier, the subterranean ocean where Enki dwells, where he will later conceive the plan to create humanity. It is built on deicide, on the murder of the father by the son, on the overthrow of the primal order. Ea and his consort Damkina then produce a child in this new dwelling. They create a son, and this son is no ordinary god. His name is Marduk, and he will change everything. The text describes Marduk's birth and nature with language that verges on the cosmic and the monstrous. He is perfect, the poem says. His godhead is doubled. He is elevated far above the other gods, superior in every way. His limbs are ingeniously made, beyond comprehension, impossible to understand, too difficult to perceive. And then comes the description that has fascinated and puzzled scholars for centuries. 4 were his eyes, 4 were his ears. When his lips moved, fire blazed forth. The 4 ears were enormous, and likewise the eyes. They perceived everything. Marduk is a being of supernatural perception and power. He sees in all directions simultaneously. He hears everything. And when he speaks, his words are fire. This is not a gentle creator god. This is a weapon. Anu, Marduk's great-grandfather, is so impressed by the child that he gives him a toy to play with. The 4 winds. Think about that for a moment. The god of the sky gives the child god the winds themselves as playthings. And Marduk, like any energetic child, uses his toys enthusiastically. He stirs up the waters, he creates storms, he makes waves and disturbances that had never existed before. The commotion is tremendous, and it enrages Tiamat. She has already lost her husband. Absu is dead, killed by her own offspring. She did not seek vengeance for that, did not rally to his defense. Some versions suggest she was conflicted, torn between love for her spouse and love for her children. But now the disruption is too much, the noise, the chaos, the constant disturbance created by young Marduk playing with the winds, pushes her past her limit. Other gods, those who sided with the older order, who preferred the primordial quiet, come to her and complain. When they killed Absu, your husband, they say, you did not march at his side, you sat still, but now Marduk has been born and he churns up Tiamat, disturbing your interior. We cannot rest, cannot sleep. They urge her to action. Take vengeance, they say. Make them pay for what they have done. And Tiamat finally agrees. She transforms from the primal mother into the mother of monsters. She creates an army. The text lists them with relish. Monstrous serpents, sharp of tooth, with merciless fangs, dragons, scorpion men, fishmen, storm demons, and other hybrid horrors. She fills them with venom instead of blood. She clothes them with terror. She makes them into weapons of mass destruction. And to lead this army she elevates Kingu, her new consort, giving him the tablets of destiny, the most sacred objects in the cosmos, which grant authority over fate itself. The war is coming. The young gods Ea's generation are terrified. They have unleashed something they cannot control. Tiamat and her monster army are marching toward them, and they do not know how to respond. Ea himself, clever as he is, cannot devise a strategy. Anu, the sky god, cannot think of a solution. They are paralyzed with fear. They hold a council, and one god after another refuses the call to face Tiamat. It is too dangerous. She is too powerful. The monsters are too terrible. No one will volunteer. And then Marduk steps forward. He is young, he is powerful, and he is ambitious. He offers to fight Tiamat, to face her army, to save the gods from destruction. But he demands a price. If I am to be your champion, he tells the divine assembly, if I am to save you from annihilation, then I must be made supreme. I must be given kingship over all the gods. My word must become law. My commands must be obeyed without question. It is a bold demand, an audacious power grab. But the gods are desperate. They have no alternative. They agree. They hold a feast, drink themselves into a state of jubilation and relief, and they grant Marduk absolute authority. They give him a throne. They give him royal vestments. They declare him king, and then they send him to war. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is the centerpiece of the Enuma Elish, the moment toward which the entire narrative has been building. Marduk arms himself with an arsenal of divine weapons. He carries a bow and arrow, he brandishes a mace, he wields lightning. He wraps himself in a cloak of terror, and most importantly, he harnesses the winds, those same four winds he played with as a child, now transformed into weapons. He adds to them the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the whirling wind, the wind that has no equal. These are not natural phenomena. These are supernatural forces, storm powers that can tear apart reality itself. Marduk rides into battle on a storm chariot surrounded by tempest, and he confronts Tiamat face to face. The text describes their encounter with dramatic intensity. Tiamat and Marduk, the wisest of the gods, advanced against each other. They engaged in combat. They approached for battle. They drew near in single combat. The Lord spread out his net and caught her. He let loose the evil wind that was behind him in her face. Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow him, and he made the evil wind enter so she could not close her lips. The fierce winds filled her belly. Her belly was distended. She opened wide her mouth. He shot an arrow, and it split her belly. It cut through her innards, slicing through her heart. He subdued her and destroyed her life. He threw down her corpse and stood upon it. Marduk has won. Tiamat is dead. The primordial mother, the chaos goddess, the embodiment of the salt waters, lies slain. But the Thenton's battle is not quite over. Her army of monsters must be dealt with. Marduk captures them, takes the tablets of destiny from Kingu, and binds all the rebel gods as prisoners. The old order has been completely overthrown. The young gods, with Marduk at their head, are now the supreme power in the universe. And then comes the act of creation. Marduk stands over the corpse of Tiamat, and he considers what to do with her massive body. She is immense, large enough to have contained entire oceans within her. And Marduk makes a decision that will define the structure of the cosmos for all time. He takes out his weapon. He slices Tiamat's body in half like a fish being prepared for market. He splits her. One half he raises up to become the sky, the firmament, the dome of heaven. He sets guards there to make sure her waters do not escape, to hold them in place so they do not flood down upon the earth. The other half he lays down to become the earth, the solid ground beneath our feet. From her eyes, he makes the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From other parts of her body, he creates mountains, clouds, mist. Every feature of the physical world comes from the dismembered corpse of the chaos goddess. This is creation through violence. This is order emerging not from divine speech or benevolent intention, but from warfare, from murder, from the desecration of a maternal body. It is a cosmogony that encodes violence at the very foundation of reality. The world itself is built from a crime scene, and this has profound implications for Mesopotamian theology and worldview. If the cosmos is created through violent conquest, then violence is fundamental to existence. Chaos is always lurking, always threatening to return. Order must be constantly maintained through force, through vigilance, through the willingness to wage war against anything that threatens stability. This is why Marduk becomes the supreme god. Not because he is the oldest or the wisest or the most loving, but because he is the most powerful warrior. He proved his supremacy through combat. He won his throne through victory, and his authority rests on his ability to use violence to maintain order. The other gods recognize this. They praise him. They sing hymns to his glory. They give him 50 names, each representing a different aspect of his power. He is Asari who bestows cultivation. He is Asaroalim, who in council is supreme. He is Asaroalim Nuna, light of the Father who created him. The list goes on, a litany of attributes and powers, each title another acknowledgement of his supremacy. But there is still a problem. With the war over, with Tiamat defeated and the universe structured, the gods find themselves facing the same issue that led to the creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic. They need workers. Someone has to maintain the world, someone has to perform the rituals, make the offerings, do the labour that keeps the cosmic order functioning. The Anunnaki cannot do it all themselves. They are exhausted from the war. They need rest. They need servants. And so Marduk, in consultation with his father Ea, proposes a solution. They will create a new being, a helper for the gods, a worker to bear the burden, and they will make their being from the blood of a god, specifically from the blood of one of the rebels, one of Tiamat's allies who sided with chaos against order. The Divine Council interrogates the prisoners. Who was responsible for instigating Tiamat's rebellion, they ask. Who led her to wage war? And the gods identify Kingu, Tiamat's consort, the one who wore the Tablets of Destiny, as the guilty party. They bring him forward, they execute him, they sever his blood vessels, and from his divine blood mixed with clay, Ea creates the first human. The text describes this with stark clarity. Ea created mankind on whom he imposed the service of the gods and set the gods free. This is the purpose of humanity according to the Enuma Elish. We are made from the blood of a condemned god, a rebel, a loser in the cosmic war. We are created specifically to serve, to work, to free the gods from labour. We are, from the moment of our creation, defined by our function as servants. And there is something deeply significant about the fact that we are made from the blood of Kingu, from the essence of one who fought against the established order. We carry within us, according to this myth, the blood of rebellion. We are created from a criminal, a revolutionary, one who stood against the supreme authority. This ambiguity, this tension between our role as servants and our heritage as children of chaos, runs through all of Mesopotamian thought about humanity. We are meant to serve, but we carry within us the capacity for defiance. We are created to maintain order, but we are made from the very substance of disorder. This is the paradox at the heart of human existence in the Mesopotamian worldview. The relationship between the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic is complex and debated among scholars. They tell similar stories, creation followed by divine need for human labour, but they frame it differently. The Atrahasis focuses on the labour dispute among the gods themselves, with the Igigi rebellion as the central drama. The Enuma Elish focuses on cosmic war and the establishment of Marduk's kingship, with human creation as almost an afterthought, a practical necessity mentioned near the end. Both agree on the fundamental point that humans were created to work for the gods. but they arrive at that conclusion through different narrative paths. What they reveal together is a consistent Mesopotamian understanding of the world before humans existed. It was a world of gods doing what they should not have had to do. In the Atrahasis, gods were digging canals. In the Enuma Elish, gods were waging war against primordial chaos. Both activities were exhausting, dangerous, and ultimately unsustainable for divine beings. Both led to the same solution, the creation of a replacement species to handle the difficult work. Humans are the answer to divine exhaustion, whether that exhaustion comes from manual labour or from cosmic warfare. This dual origin story, labour and war, shapes how the Mesopotamians understood their relationship with the divine. They lived in a world that required constant work to maintain. The irrigation systems had to be perpetually dredged and repaired. The temples had to be built and rebuilt. The fields had to be constantly tended. This was not optional. Without this labour, civilization would collapse, the rivers would flood uncontrollably, the crops would fail, the cities would crumble, so work was sacred. It was the human purpose, it was what we were made for. But at the same time, the Mesopotamians lived in a world of constant conflict. City-states warred with each other. Empires rose and fell through military conquest. Chaos was always threatening to return, whether in the form of foreign invasion, internal rebellion, or natural disaster. Order had to be maintained through force, through walls and armies and the willingness to fight. The Enuma Elish validated this militaristic worldview. It said that violence was fundamental to creation, that war was how order was established, that the supreme god was the supreme warrior. These two narratives, the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish, thus provide complementary explanations for why life was the way it was in ancient Mesopotamia. Life was hard work, and that work was sacred duty. Life was violent conflict, and that conflict was cosmic necessity. Both realities were encoded in the myths of what the gods did before humans existed. The figure of Marduk in the Enuma Elish is particularly important for understanding the political theology of Babylon. The text is not just a creation story, it is propaganda. It is a carefully crafted narrative designed to justify Babylon's dominance over other Mesopotamian cities and Marduk's supremacy over other older gods. In the earlier Sumerian traditions, Enlil was the king of the gods. He was the supreme authority, the one who commanded obedience. But Babylon wanted its patron deity to hold that position. So they created or adapted the Enuma Elish to show Marduk earning his kingship through martial prowess, through saving the other gods from destruction. He proved himself worthy not through inheritance or decree, but through action, through combat, through victory. This made his authority unquestionable. The other gods had agreed to make him king. They had witnessed his power. They had benefited from his salvation. They owed him everything. When Assyria later conquered Babylon, Assyrian scribes simply replaced Marduk's name with Asher, their own god, in their copies of the text. The narrative structure was so effective as political theology that it could be adapted by simply swapping the name of the supreme deity. The story itself, the pattern of cosmic war leading to divine kingship leading to human creation, was apparently considered universally valid. Any great god could be plugged into Marduk's role. This raises fascinating questions about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood their own mythology. Did they believe these stories literally? Did they think there had actually been a cosmic war, that Tiamat was an actual entity who was killed and dismembered? Or did they understand these as symbolic narratives, as poetic expressions of theological and political truths? The answer is probably both, or rather, the distinction between literal and symbolic may not have existed for them in the way it does for us. The myths were true in the sense that they revealed fundamental realities about the nature of existence, about power and order and the relationship between gods and humans. Whether they were also historically true in some factual sense was perhaps not the primary concern. They were enacted truths, performed truths, ritualized truths. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration. The recitation was not just a religious observance, it was a renewal of the cosmic order. By speaking the words again, by performing the myth, the priests and people were participating in Marduk's victory. They were reinforcing his kingship. They were ensuring that chaos would remain defeated for another year. The myth was not a story about the past. It was an active force in the present, maintaining reality itself. This understanding of myth as performative, as something that does not just describe reality but actually shapes it, helps us grasp what the Mesopotamians thought the Anunnaki were doing before humans existed. They were not just building infrastructure or fighting wars, they were establishing the fundamental patterns that would govern all subsequent existence. When the Igigi dug the Tigris and Euphrates, they were not just making waterways, they were creating the template for all human labour. When Marduk defeated Tiamat, he was not just winning a battle, he was proving that order could triumph over chaos, that structure could emerge from formlessness, that authority could be legitimate if it was powerful enough. These primordial events set precedents, they created the rules. And humans, created in the aftermath of these events, inherited a world shaped by the divine labour and divine violence, a world where work was sacred and conflict was inevitable, a world where we were always servants, but also always children of a rebel god, always torn between obedience and defiance. The comparison with other ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean creation myths is instructive. The biblical book of Genesis, compiled by Hebrew scribes during or after the Babylonian exile, shows clear influence from the Enuma Elish, but it systematically transforms and subverts the Mesopotamian narrative. Where the Enuma Elish begins with primordial waters and multiple gods emerging from them, Genesis begins with one god creating through speech. Where the Enuma Elish has creation through violence, Genesis has creation through command. Where Tiamat is split to form sky and earth, God simply separates the waters above from the waters below. The chaos is not defeated, it is ordered. The violence is removed from the story, or rather, it is relocated to the margins, to the Leviathan who is mentioned in passing in the Psalms but who does not feature in the main creation narrative. And crucially, where the Mesopotamian myths have humanity created as an afterthought to serve the gods, Genesis has humanity as the climax of creation, made in the divine image, given dominion over the earth. The narrative priorities are completely reversed. This suggests that the Hebrew writers knew the Mesopotamian stories and deliberately constructed an alternative vision, one that elevated humanity's status and removed violence from the foundational moment of creation. Greek mythology, as recorded in Hesiod's Theogony, shows a different kind of transformation. Like the Enuma Elish, it features generations of gods in conflict, with younger gods overthrowing older ones through violence. Kronos castrates and overthrows his father Uranus. Zeus leads a war against the Titans, his father's generation, and defeats them, consigning them to Tartarus. The pattern is similar to Marduk defeating Tiamat and the older gods. Both cultures mythologize the transition from older forms of divinity to newer ones, from chthonic earth powers to sky gods, from primordial chaos to organized pantheons. And both used warfare as the mechanism of transition. But the Greek myths do not include the specific element of divine labour that is so central to Mesopotamian stories. The Greek gods do not dig canals or create humans to be workers. Humans are created by Prometheus, and their purpose is more ambiguous, more tragic. They receive fire, knowledge, and suffering, but not a clear mandate to serve as labourers for the gods. The emphasis is different. The anxieties are different. Each culture's creation mythology reveals what that culture considered fundamental about existence. For the Mesopotamians, work and order were fundamental. For the Hebrews, divine sovereignty and human dignity were fundamental. For the Greeks, transgenerational conflict and the relationship between knowledge and suffering were fundamental. Returning to the Sumerian and Babylonian texts, we must consider the environmental and historical context that shaped these myths. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is a harsh and challenging environment. It can support civilization, but only through intensive, organised effort. The rivers flood unpredictably. Without canals and dikes, agriculture is nearly impossible. The soil can become salinized without proper drainage, turning fertile land into barren waste. The climate is extreme, brutally hot in summer, with sandstorms and droughts. Maintaining civilization in such an environment requires constant labour by large numbers of people working in coordination. It requires social organisation, hierarchical authority, and the acceptance of hard work as necessary and sacred. The myths reflect this reality. The Igigi dig in canals for 40 years before rebelling is not just a story about gods, it is a story about the actual experience of Mesopotamian workers who spent their entire lives maintaining irrigation systems. The creation of humans to take over the labour is not just theology, it is a mythological framing of the social reality that most people's lives were defined by forced labour either for the state or for the temple estates. The myths make this bearable by saying it is divinely ordained. You are made for this. This is your purpose. This is what the gods need from you. It is a powerful form of social control through religion, but it is also an acknowledgement of a harsh truth. Without this labour, everyone dies. The work must be done. And so the myths explain why. The texts also preserve memories of real historical events. The frequent mentions of floods in Mesopotamian mythology almost certainly reflect actual catastrophic flooding events. Archaeological evidence shows multiple flood layers in ancient Mesopotamian cities, evidence of times when the rivers overflowed their banks and destroyed settlements. The most famous of these floods occurred around 2,900 years before the Common Era, and some scholars believe this event may be the historical basis for the flood stories in the Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and eventually Genesis. The experience of catastrophic flooding, of seeing the world destroyed by water, of losing everything and having to rebuild, would naturally be incorporated into religious narratives as divine punishment or divine will. The gods sent the flood. The gods saved one man and his family. The gods promised it would not happen again, or at least not without warning. These stories helped process collective trauma and provided frameworks for understanding disaster. If the flood came from the gods, then it had a meaning. It was not random, it was not senseless. It was part of a larger divine plan, however inscrutable that plan might be. The obsession with noise in Mesopotamian myths, the recurring motif of gods being disturbed by the clamour of their creations, may also reflect real social anxieties. Cities are noisy places. As Mesopotamian urban centres grew larger and more densely populated, the constant sound of human activity, thousands of people working, trading, arguing, celebrating, mourning, would have been overwhelming to those not accustomed to it. And more abstractly, noise could represent disorder, lack of control, the threatening presence of autonomous wills that are not being properly managed. When Enlil complains that he cannot sleep because of the noise of humanity, this could be read as a metaphor for ruling class anxiety about the governed population becoming too numerous, too active, too difficult to control. The solution in the myths is population control through plague, famine, and flood. These are not random acts of divine malice. They are, from the perspective of the gods, rational administrative decisions. Too many humans create problems, reduce their numbers, implement measures to keep population in check. This chillingly pragmatic approach to population management reflects real historical practices. Ancient states did indeed implement policies to control population size, whether through infanticide, exposure, war, or simply accepting that famines and plagues served a useful function in preventing overpopulation. All of this brings us back to the central question: what were the Anunnaki doing before humans existed? According to the texts, they were working, they were fighting, they were building and destroying, creating and killing, establishing patterns and precedents that would define all subsequent reality. They were exhausting themselves with labour until they rebelled. They were warring against chaos until they achieved victory. They were making a world that would need constant maintenance, constant effort, constant vigilance to prevent it from sliding back into the primordial disorder from which it emerged. And then, when they could no longer sustain that effort themselves, they created us. We are the inheritors of their exhaustion. We are the solution to their problem. We are the workers who replaced the workers, the servants who freed the servants. And this is not a past that is finished and done with. This is an ongoing reality that shapes how we understand work, power, purpose, and existence itself. The rivers still need to be maintained. The fields still need to be tended. Order still needs to be defended against chaos, and we are still the ones doing it. In the silence of deep time, in the darkness before cities rose, the gods learned something fundamental. They learned their limitations. They learned that even divine beings cannot do everything forever. They learned that power alone is not enough if that power must be exercised constantly without rest. They learned that systems need maintenance, that creation is not a one-time act, but an ongoing process, that order is fragile and chaos is patient. And so they made us, and we have inherited their work, their war, their weariness, but we have also inherited something they did not intend to give us. We inherited the knowledge that workers can rebel, that systems can be changed, that the way things are is not the way things must always be. The Igigi showed us that. They burned their tools and surrounded the house of their oppressor and refused to continue. And the gods had to negotiate, had to find a different solution, had to adapt. That knowledge is our inheritance too. Not just the burden of work, but the memory of resistance. Not just the duty to serve, but the possibility of refusal. The silence returns, the same silence that existed before creation. But it is different now. It is not empty. It is full of the echoes of ancient pickaxes striking stone, full of the sound of baskets being dropped in defiance, full of the whisper of Enki speaking to a reed wall saving the world through a technicality, full of the clash of Marduk's weapons against Tiamat's body, the violence that made the sky and earth, full of the memory of what the gods did before we existed, what they suffered, what they built, what they destroyed, and what they created when they reached their limit. The work continues, the river flows, the story endures, and we, the children of exhausted gods and executed rebels, continue the labour that was too much even for immortals to bear. But we do it with the knowledge that even divine authority can be challenged, even cosmic order can be reshaped, even the fundamental patterns of existence are not as fixed as those in power would have us believe. The Igigi refused and the world changed. What might change if we refuse? The question hangs in the air like the smell of tools burning, like the sound of a cosmic rebellion that was never fully silenced, only transformed into the human story that began when the divine story ended, or rather, when the divine story became our inheritance, our burden, our opportunity, our unfinished work.